Adolf Hitler is one of the most feared political leaders in the history of the world, but one question about him remains unanswered until today. Is Adolf Hitler actually good at chess? To answer this question, we're looking at the historical game Vladimir Lenin versus Adolf Hitler from the year 1909, as well as two other historical chess games including political leaders like Karl Marx and Napoleon Bonaparte, and we're doing all of this to finally answer the question, is Adolf Hitler actually good at chess? Now, here in our first game, Vladimir Lenin is playing as white. He opens 1e4, and Adolf Hitler, he doesn't respond e5, he doesn't go c5, or any other of the main lines. Here, he goes for the St. George defense with the move 1a6. Now, already, this is a big surprise by Adolf Hitler. Here, Hitler trying to gain territory on the queen side with the move b5 next. That is the idea of the St. George. And that is what happens here. White goes d4, gaining space. And then Adolf Hitler, b5, expanding on the queen side. So how is Vladimir Lenin going to respond to Adolf Hitler's very unusual opening? Well, he finds the right idea. He starts knight to f3. Very simple development. Then Hitler, e6 in the spirit of the French defense. His idea may include c5 in the near future, trying to gain more space on the queen side. So that does sound like Adolf Hitler trying to gain territory whenever he can by any means possible. Now here, Vladimir Lenin, he stays cool, calm, and collected as political leaders tend to do in these situations. Here he goes bishop d3, a very standard developing idea in chess. Of course, the idea, just getting the bishop to a very good square and setting up short castles on the king side. So excellent textbook play by Vladimir Lenin so far in this game. Now Hitler, he does follow up with that queenside expansion, c5. Hitler trying to strike at the heart of his opponent from the side. Now here, Lenin, he has a choice. You can take on c5, go c3, try to bolster your pawn center, or just wait and allow black to take on d4, then recapture with the knight. In the game, Lenin goes for the first option, d takes c5. This move may be a little bit weaker as it does speed up black's development. Here, black can recapture with the bishop. That is what he does. And now his kingside pieces over here are starting to come into play. And Hitler may be able to go knight to e7 or knight f6 next, and then short castles on the king side and have a decent game. So now here, Lenin, he simply castles on the king side, a very natural developing move. And now I would have expected something like knight to f6 or knight to e7 from Hitler, trying to castle that king on the king side. Instead, here, Hitler goes bishop b7, finally feeding ketoing that bishop on the b7 square and exerting pressure on that pawn on e4. So far, Hitler understanding in chess, just as in war, you want to put as much pressure on your opponent as humanly possible. However, Lenin is not fazed. Here, he simply goes queen to e2, over defending that pawn on the e4 square. Now, there will be no bishop e4 ideas, as that pawn is being defended by that bishop and the queen on e2. Now here, Hitler, he is done playing games. He goes for his big idea, queen to b6, setting up pressure on this diagonal here. He may even want to go bishop takes f2 in the future. So Hitler showing off his blitzkrieg lightning war style of chess that he was so famous for on the battlefield. Now here, Lenin, he goes a4, expanding on the queen side, a very good move. Simply trying to break up black's pawn structure over here on the queen side. If this pawn on b5 falls, then Lenin's going to have an excellent game. Now here, Hitler has a choice. You can wait and do nothing and allow a takes b5, or you can take on a4, or finally, you can go for the move b4, trying to block those pawns on the queen side. Now, which move does he do? In the game, he does take on the a4 square. This is a little bit weak. Instead, he really should have thought about simply b4, try to lock down that queen side and not give white additional ideas. Instead, b takes a4 on the board for Hitler. Now, Vladimir Lenin, he finds the best idea, a very simple one, knight to c3. This move is simple but deadly. That knight on the c3 square is now threatening knight takes a4, and from there, it'll fork both the queen and the bishop. Now, Hitler's dark squared bishop on the c5 square, that bishop right here is very, very valuable for black. He simply cannot lose it. If he does, his dark squares on the king side are going to be incredibly weak. Now here, what does Hitler do? Does he defend against the threat? He does not. He goes a3, a very dubious move. Instead, something like queen to c7 was mandatory. That way, if white goes knight to a4, you can retreat the bishop back to, say, the e7 square, and then you keep both your queen and the bishop on the board, and your king side will stay defended for a while. Now, instead, a3 on the board. Again, a very bad move by Hitler. Hitler not known for good defensive maneuver. He's more of an attacking player. So now, here, Lenin simply takes the pawn on the a3 square. A little bit of a mistake. Instead, the immediate knight to a4 would have been more precise, forking both the queen and the bishop. Then you can win the bishop, followed by that pawn on the a3 square. Now, instead, b takes a3 on the board. And here, Hitler finds the idea. He has to get his queen away from being forced by the knight on the a4 square. So he goes queen to a5, putting pressure on that knight on the c3 square. Now, I may not be a World War II scholar, but I do have the impression that Hitler likes putting pressure on his opponents. So with that in mind, this move queen to a5 really does seem like a move Hitler would play, trying to knock off that knight on the c3 square. Now, how is Lenin going to defend, or does he even defend the threat at all? In the game, he goes bishop b2, a good move, defending the knight on the c3 square, and if that knight ever moves, that bishop is going to be slicing across this board, hitting that g7 point. So Lenin really showing off the strength of these bishops in these open positions. Unlike the knights that are more short-range, stocky pieces, these bishops can go just so far with their attacking potential. Now here, Hitler, knight to f6, a very weak move. The problem with this move is it's vulnerable to an e5 attack by white. Instead, knight to e7 would have been the better developing move. From e7, the knight cannot be attacked by a pawn, and then black can simply castle on the king side. So instead, knight f6 on the board, and here Lenin, he finds the idea, e5. He strikes into the center, into the heart of Hitler's position in a way that would make Hitler himself blush. Now, what is black going to do? Black here, he goes knight d5. Good move from Hitler, but now Lenin, he's not slowing down. Knight takes d5, then bishop takes, and then Vladimir Lenin, he finds the key idea. This is actually quite impressive for a chess game played in 1909, when chess theory really wasn't that well developed. Knight g5, the idea, of course, he wants to go queen to h5 next. From there, the queen and the knight are pressuring that pawn on the f7 square. So if Hitler doesn't spot this threat and allows queen to h5, he is going to be in a world of trouble. Now, what should he be doing here? One good idea is simply g6, again, taking control of that h5 square, stopping queen h5 ideas from white. Instead, he doesn't find that. Queen d8 on the board from Hitler. I mean, it looks like it makes sense at first glance, pressuring the knight on the g5 square. However, it does nothing to stop the threat of queen to h5, or, in this position, even better, queen g4, as played by Vladimir Lenin. Now the queen indirectly attacking that pawn on the g7 square. So in chess, just as in war, you have to attack your opponent's weak spots. You have to identify them and then strike in blitzkrieg fashion. And here, Vladimir Lenin finding exactly the best way to do that. Now Hitler, he is not known for his defensive chess, or for that matter, his defensive stance on the world stage. Here, he is done defending, and he lashes out on the king side with the move h5, striking at the queen, white's most valuable piece. Now, of course, white's going to have to do something about the queen. You can't allow Hitler to capture your queen. That would be devastating. Now, Lenin, what does he do? Well, he finds a very simple move, queen g3, getting the queen out of the attack. But just when you think Hitler is done attacking, he strikes again with the move h3, once again hitting the queen. Now the queen has to move again. Vladimir Lenin goes queen g4. This makes sense, but here Hitler has an incredible idea. He actually has the ability to strike again with the h-pawn into the heart of white's position with the move h3. This is a move that the Google computer engine AlphaZero actually popularized in its famous match versus Stockfish, the other strongest chess engine in the world. The idea, you just launch your h-pawn all the way down into the heart of the enemy's territory, and from there, no matter what the opponent does, either g takes or g3, that pawn on h3 is going to exist forever, or it's going to damage white's pawn structure. So that would have been the key idea. Of course, this chess game between Hitler and Lenin played almost a century before AlphaZero and all this theory got developed. Instead, here Hitler goes g6, trying to defend the king side. Now, this move looks very logical, trying to block the queen's access to that g7 square in the future. But here, Vladimir Lenin found a way to strike into the heart of Hitler's territory in a way that shocked even Hitler himself. Here, Vladimir Lenin finds the key move, knight takes f7, a truly brilliant knight sacrifice. Now, what's the idea of this move? Well, here, if Adolf Hitler takes the knight, as he did in the game, king takes f7, king has to capture that knight. The problem now is that pawn on the g6 square is being attacked by both the bishop and the queen. That means Vladimir Lenin has a choice. He can recapture with either piece. Now, in the game, he finds the stronger move. Bishop takes g6, recapturing with the bishop. Now, the king has to go somewhere. King g7. But then, bishop h5, the discovered attack with the queen. The bishop moving out of the way for the queen to deliver the check. Now, Adolf Hitler, he is running. He is scared. King to f8. Adolf wants to get his king out of the attacks, but they are not slowing down. Queen to f4, once again, hitting the king on the f8 square. Now, where's the king supposed to go? It doesn't have a lot of good squares. For example, if you go to king to e7, then bang, queen to f7 is checkmate. The king has nowhere to go. So instead of that, here Hitler goes for the other idea, king to g7. But then Vladimir Lenin, he's not done. Queen to f7, jumping in with the queen, obliterating the king. Now the king only has one square, king to h6. But as soon as he goes there, Vladimir Lenin is going to deliver the checkmate on the g6 square. For example, king to h6, then queen g6 is checkmate, and Adolf Hitler will be blown off the board. Now, for that reason, in this position right here, Adolf Hitler, he knows when he's done. He resigns on the spot on move 22 to Vladimir Lenin. Wow, what an interesting game. Adolf Hitler clearly demonstrating some level of chess knowledge, but not quite enough to best Vladimir Lenin in this game. Now, don't go anywhere. Our next game featuring Karl Marx is going to blow your mind. Now, how do Adolf Hitler's chess skills compare to that of someone like Karl Marx, another top political figure? Well, let's find out right here in this game. In the game, Karl Marx opens 1e4, best by test, then e5 from Friedrich Mayer. Then here, Karl Marx, he goes for, if there's one opening that can be described as a blitzkrieg, it is this one right here, 2f4, the King's Gambit. What's the idea behind this move? Well, it's very simple. Here, white is giving up that pawn on the f4 square. In the game, black does take it. And then after that, white's going to have a very fast attack against the black king. You can follow up d4 or ideas like knight to f3, bishop c4, and then short castles. And this open f-file is going to mean black's king is going to be vulnerable. Now in the game, Karl Marx goes bishop c4, targeting that pawn on the f7 square. So Karl Marx here already having very aggressive intentions that would make Hitler himself blush. Now, what is black going to do? The best idea is actually queen to h4, giving the king a check on the e1 square. Then white may be forced to do something like king to e2 or king f1. Now instead here, black goes for the move g5. This move is very common if white starts knight to f3 instead of bishop c4. However, here, without that knight on the f3 square, this move is quite a bit weaker, as white can strike on the king side with the key idea of h4, trying to deflect that pawn off the g5 square right here. Now, fortunately for Heinrich Mayer, Karl Marx didn't find this idea. Instead, he continues knight to f3 with the idea of going short castles on the king side. And now here, black corrects his mistake. He just goes for it on the king side with the move g4, threatening the knight on the f3. And now Karl Marx goes for one of the most aggressive openings in the history of chess. It is the Mozio Gambit of the King's Gambit accepted. You castle here, giving up the knight. Black's going to take it, and then you recapture with the queen on the f3 square. Now, just look at this position here. Imagine that pawn on the f4 square didn't exist. The queen, the rook, and the bishop all lining up on the weakest point in black's position, that f7 pawn. This is just so dangerous for black, and here already, Karl Marx looking like he may be a better chess player than Adolf Hitler himself. Not something I would have expected if we're looking at these games, but that's what we're seeing so far. Now, in the game, black goes queen to f6. Keep in mind, black is up an entire piece. He has two knights versus the one knight of Karl Marx. That is going to be a big problem here. Now, what does white do here? He actually goes e5, giving up yet another pawn. White being, of course, down the full piece. almost down another pawn here. What is white doing? Well, queen takes e5 on the board, and then here's simply d3 from Karl Marx, targeting that pawn on the f4 square. And now if he gains it with the bishop, say bishop takes f4, that hits the queen with tempo. So that was the idea. Of course, I do have to mention, instead of d3, there was the insane idea, bishop takes f7, giving up the bishop to further the attack. But of course, that wasn't played in the game. Instead, d3, very solid move. And now black goes bishop to h6, defending the pawn on the f4 square. Black showing very good technique here. Now Karl Marx, knight to c3. Again, continuing his Adolf Hitler-style blitzkrieg attack in the game. Now black, knight to e7, and then bishop d2 from Karl Marx is simply intending rook to d1, or rook to e1, sorry. At that point, the rook will target the queen, and white's going to have a vicious attack on the e-file against the black king. Now, how does black respond? Knight bc6, getting the knight into the game, then rook e1 from Karl Marx, and finally queen to f5, getting the queen out of the attack of the rook. But now the rook's still lined up with that black king on the e8 square. Now, knight d5, targeting that pawn on the c7 square. If white wins that, he's literally going to fork the king and the rook on the a8 squares. Black goes king d8, defending the pawn, but then bishop c3, lining up more and more threats, this time against that rook on the a8 square. Black's got to move the rook somewhere or do something to defend it. Now, rook g8 defends the rook, and puts the rook on that open g-file, potentially threatening future ideas on that g2 square. Now here, bishop to f6 from white. Already things are looking very, very dire for black. Here, white actually threatening to win the knight on the e7 square, as that knight is attacked 3 times by the bishop, the knight, and the rook, and only defended twice by the king and the knight. So this knight not long for the world here. Well, in the game, black finds a key tactical idea. Bishop g5, indirectly defending the e7 square with the bishop. If white goes bishop takes, then bishop takes e7, wins back the bishop. So that will be defended. Now, it turns out bishop takes e7 is actually the best idea anyway. Instead of that here, white takes the bishop on the g5 square with the bishop. Bishop takes g5 on the board. Now queen takes. And here black is lining up threats against Karl Marx's king, particularly that weak g2 point. Now from here, what is Karl Marx going to do? Well, knight takes f4, wins that pawn on the f4 square, but then Heinrich Mayer, knight to e5, bringing in the knight, queen to e4, brings the queen out of the attack of the knight, but then d6, staying cool, calm, and collected, simply bolstering that knight on the e5 square. It is going nowhere. Now here, Karl Marx, he turns up the aggression even more, the very shocking idea. h4, trying to deflect the queen and giving up yet another pawn on the h4 square. Now, of course, the pawn on h4 cannot be taken. If black does that, say queen takes h4, then black is actually going to lose the queen to a very powerful tactical shot. Knight to e6, hitting the king with check, and if black takes the knight, then the queen on h4 is undefended. You simply take the queen and win the game. So overall, queen takes h4, not a possibility. Therefore, this blitzkrieg-style move that would make Adolf Hitler himself blush, h4, turns out to be a very strong idea. Now the queen, it has to go back. The best square might be queen g7, but instead here Heinrich Mayer goes forward with the queen to g4 on the board. And this means that pawn on the f7 square can be taken. Bishop takes f7 on the board. Now, of course, that bishop is being attacked by the knight, but if you take with the knight, then queen takes e7 is going to be checkmate. You cannot allow that. Therefore, bishop takes f7 wins a clean pawn. So again, this is showing the importance of queen to g7 instead on the prior move. Now here black, rook f8, gets the rook out of the attack of the bishop and pressures the bishop on the f7 square. But now bishop to h5 hits the queen. Karl Marx, he is just really showing off in this game. I am wildly impressed by his King's Gambit blitzkrieg-style chess. Now queen g7 finally gets the queen back to where it should have been, maybe 2 or 3 moves prior. And now d4 knocks off that knight off the e5 square. Where's that knight going to go? In the game, knight c6 is played by Heinrich Mayer, getting the knight out of the attack, but then c3 simply bolsters that pawn on d4. here white, it just has a dominant position. Yes, he is down material. Yes, black does have that extra knight, but just look at all of these pieces, the bishop, the queen, the knight, all jumping in at the black king here. All right, what should black be doing to hold on here? Well, there's a few good ideas. For example, one idea is knight to f5, bringing the knight off that vulnerable e7 square where all of white's pieces are targeting it. Beyond that, perhaps rook g8, also a good move, piling up pressure on that g2 point. Now, instead of these moves here, Heinrich Mayer plays a very dubious move, maybe even a downright blunder, a5. Now, this move is incredibly strange. It simply ignores the entire fight in the middle of the board, and here white jumps in with the knight, knight to e6. Karl Marx finding the key idea. Now, this here is a beautiful follow-up by Karl Marx. After bishop takes e6, you don't take with the queen right away. First, rook takes f8, wins the rook. Black takes back. Then you take with the queen. And now the follow-up threat is rook to f1, followed by rook to f7, piling up pressure on that knight. Now rook a6, black, I don't know how to describe this move here, but then rook to f1 hits the queen. The queen goes to g7. Then bishop g4 threatens checkmate on the d7 square. If black wastes a move, say h5, then queen d7 literally wins the game on the spot. Black can't do that. He finds the only move, knight to b8, defending the e7 square with the knight here. But then rook to f7, hitting both the queen and the knight. The knight's going to fall, or something's going to fall. And in this position, Heinrich Mayer resigns on the spot to Karl Marx. So overall here, Adolf Hitler looking quite a bit weaker than Karl Marx. And Karl Marx demonstrating some beautiful attacking chess here that would make Adolf Hitler during World War II blush. This was some true blitzkrieg-style attacking chess. But now, before you go, we have one more game before we can fully assess the strength of Adolf Hitler in the game of chess versus other political figures. Now, in the last game, we saw Karl Marx demonstrating his chess skills. He's looking much stronger than Adolf Hitler. And now, in this game, we're going to compare Adolf Hitler's chess skills to that of Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the greatest, most accomplished conquerors in the history of the planet. Now, in the game here, Napoleon opens with the move 1, knight to c3, a very interesting idea, developing his knight before doing anything else in the game. Now, black responds e5, very classical move, trying to control the center of the board with the pawns. Now, knight to f3 from Napoleon. Napoleon just loves his cavalry in this game, loves bringing those knights out. Now, black, d6, a little bit of a passive move, perhaps instead say knight to c6. Defending the pawn on the e5 square would have been stronger, but d6 on the board instead by black. Now here, Napoleon e4, transposing to some sort of e4, e5 opening. And now here, the best idea for black is going to be something like knight to f6, but instead here, Madame, she goes for the kingside break with the move f5 in the spirit of the king's gambit opening for white. Now, this move is very weak, as Madame has not developed any of her major pieces in this game. She's only moving her pawns. And here, Napoleon has a couple of very strong ideas. One is simply d4, trying to blow open the center of the board, thanks to the fact that he already has the knights out into the game. And the other idea is bishop c4 is setting up various sacrificial ideas. Even knight takes e5 next is possible here. Now, instead of those moves, here Napoleon plays sort of a waiting move, h3, trying to gain control of the g4 square. It wasn't really necessary yet, but this is what Napoleon does in the game. Now from here, black goes f takes e4, winning the pawn on the e4 square. Napoleon recaptures with the knight, and now knight to c6, ignoring the development of the kingside. Now here, after this move f5, you have to get those kingside pieces into the game and castle right away. If you don't, then white can launch a vicious attack, and that's what happens in the game. Here, knight c6, then knight f to g5 from Napoleon. Not an objectively strong move, actually a big mistake. However, again, Napoleon showing his aggressive intentions in this game. Now here, Madame does find the best idea. d5, overloading the knights. Now, of course, if you move this knight anywhere, say knight g3, then that knight on the g5 square is going to fall. So Napoleon is all in at this point. There's no turning back. He goes queen to h5. Hitting the king on the e8 square. Now, of course, if black tries to block the check with, say, g6, as Madame did in the game, then queen to f3 is the move. You're actually threatening checkmate on the f7 square. So, for example, if black takes the knight on e4, then bang, queen to f7 delivers the checkmate to the king. I'm sure Napoleon was just salivating at the idea of this blitzkrieg checkmate attack, again, that would make Adolf Hitler in his prime blush. Now, instead, here, knight to h6 was the move from black, using the knight to defend that f7 square. However, instead of that, perhaps queen to e7 was a stronger move, defending with the queen. Instead, knight to h6 on the board. Now, Napoleon, he spots a big idea. Knight to h6 was a mistake, and now Napoleon jumps in with his cavalry. Knight to f6 hits the king on the e8 square. King goes to e7, but then knight takes d5, wins the pawn. Of course, the knight being defended by the queen. Queen takes d5 is not possible. And now here, black is already in a lot of trouble. Here, Madame goes king d6, running away with the king. But this runs into all sorts of problems, starting with the move knight to e4 check. Brilliant move by Napoleon. Seriously, very, very good move, especially for the time this game was played. Now, of course, this does give up the knight on the d5 square. King takes d5 was played in the game. Of course, if black does anything else, say king d7, then Napoleon just keeps going bishop b5 with a vicious attack on the king. So you have to take the knight. King takes d5. But then, bang, bishop c4, the next piece sacrifice, giving up more and more material. The idea being if the king takes the bishop, as black did in the game, then bang, queen b3. The idea is the king has to go to d4 now, but then queen d3 is checkmate, the knight's defended, and the knight covers the c5 square. So for that reason, here in this position, Madame de Remusat resigned on the spot to Napoleon Bonaparte. So in this game, Napoleon demonstrating some excellent chess skills. Same with Karl Marx. Overall, I would give Karl Marx the edge out of all three of these players: Adolf Hitler, Karl Marx, and Napoleon Bonaparte. But this brings us back to the topic of this video. Is Adolf Hitler good at chess, and how does he compare to the other great political figures of the past? Well, I'm going to be honest. Adolf Hitler, he's only so-so at chess. He got obliterated by Vladimir Lenin. It wasn't even close. I mean, Vladimir with that vicious kingside attack. So overall, I would say Hitler is okay at chess. He's not great. He's not terrible. He's definitely not as good at chess as he is, say, conquering Europe. I'd give him a much higher rating for that, even though he ended up failing there. But overall, is Hitler good at chess? Not really. He's only okay. That's my final opinion, Chess YouTube. What do you think? Is Hitler actually good at chess, or is he not? Let me know in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and smash that like button for me, and I'll see you in the next video.